nit a tothom a aquesta darrera sessió del Cicle Futurs que organitza l'Ateneu de Barcelona i la Fundació La Caixa. Alguns de vostès sé que els veig que han estat en altres sessions d'aquest mateix cicle i alguns segurament venen a aquesta sessió d'avui per primera vegada. Durant aquests dies que hem estat discutint com pot ser el futur, hem trobat, hi ha hagut un acord bastant generalitzat entre els ponents que han participat en aquestes jornades, que vivim en temps d'incerteses en tots els àmbits pràcticament, tant si parlem d'ecologia com si parlem d'economia, com si parlem de canvis socials. Els temps són d'incerteses i, com ens va dir el professor i el filòsof Daniel Innerarity, la nostra relació amb el futur és avui més de precaució que d'esperança. Va ser molt interessant la seva xerrada. I tots han estat d'acord en que, més que viure temps de canvis, vivim un canvi d'època. És a dir, s'estan produint transformacions tan profundes en molts dels aspectes fonamentals del nostre funcionament social que moltes vegades es costa veure cap a on anem i quina és la direcció que porten aquestes tendències en les quals vivim, justament perquè hi vivim dintre i justament perquè aquestes tendències contribueixen sobretot a accelerar, per exemple, el coneixement, les dinàmiques socials, etc. Som conscients que moltes coses que donaven per certes estan avui en qüestió. I una de les coses que està en qüestió i que ha sortit en les jornades que hem tingut és la idea de la il·lustració que ha mogut i que ha sigut motor dels canvis socials durant ben bé 2 segles, és la idea que el progrés és una línia sempre ascendent. Ara veiem que es pot retrocedir, que es pot tornar enrere, que es pot perdre conquestes socials adquirides i que potser el progrés vinculat al creixement econòmic no ens porta a aquell benestar que la idea de la il·lustració ens havia dit. Ho hem vist en qüestions socials, ho estem veient en qüestions ambientals. Si continuem com estem, en la taula que vam tenir sobre medi ambient quedava molt clar que els danys que estem infringint al planeta poden ser irreversibles. De fet, ja són irreversibles. I encara que arribessin ara, o el proper any, a la reunió de París, a un acord sobre medi ambient, probablement només podrem mitigar les conseqüències del canvi climàtic. I fa una setmana, de la mà del professor Anton Costas i de Lourdes Barberia, vam comprovar com la ciència econòmica, que presumeix de ser tan predictiva o que tant s'ocupa en fer prediccions, no va ser capaç ni de predir ni de combatre una crisi que va començar sent financera i localitzada als Estats Units i que ha acabat sent una crisi general i global, una crisi de tots els sectors de l'economia i, a més, global. També hem vist com les desigualtats ja creixien abans de la crisi, però amb la crisi han accelerat el seu creixement. I en opinió de veus molt qualificades, aquesta tendència a les desigualtats, si no s'hi posa remei, pot arribar a amenaçar els fonaments mateixos de la democràcia. El canvi tecnològic, hem tingut 2 o 3 ponents molt importants que han parlat del canvi tecnològic, en el que estem immersos. I estem tan ficats i va tan ràpid que no som capaços de veure la magnitud de les transformacions que comportarà, però estem segurs que seran transformacions molt profundes. Ja hem vist que la tercera revolució industrial incrementarà molt la productivitat i això és una gran notícia. Però no està clar que aquest increment de productivitat es tradueixi en un increment de benestar per tota la població. No està clar tampoc que es distribueixi equitativament. Moltes de les feines administratives i serveis que ara fan les persones seran assumides per processos computacionals. I això vol dir que probablement, si no es modifiquen les actuals estructures socials, laborals, de l'esquema econòmic en el que vivim, el sistema econòmic no serà potser, ha sortit en les taules que hem tingut, capaç de donar feina a tota la població. I per tant, potser tindrem un atur estructural molt més important del que hem tingut fins ara. Això portarà conseqüències greus, perquè si fins ara la manera com tenia la nostra societat de que la gent participés en la vida social i econòmica era a través de la feina, que li proporcionava no només un salari i un modus de vida, sinó una manera de viure en la societat. Si la nostra economia dels països avançats i del món en general no és capaç de donar feina a tota la població, quin altre sistema tindrem perquè la gent estigui inclosa i no exclosa en les dinàmiques socials? Bé, mantenir un nivell de creixement econòmic sostenible per garantir la qualitat de vida dels ciutadans i preservar la sostenibilitat del medi ambient en el planeta, un planeta cada cop més poblat i amb menys recursos a repartir entre més, són els grans reptes del futur. Podríem resumir-los en aquests dos. Però una crisi sempre és també un moment de grans oportunitats. Depèn del que fem, el futur no està escrit, anirà en una direcció o anirà en una altra. En aquesta darrera secció hem volgut veure quines són les megatendències que haurem d'afrontar en les properes dècades. I hem volgut convidar a una persona que està a una talaia privilegiada per veure aquestes tendències. És el Jock Martin. Ell és cap del programa d'avaluacions ambientals integrades de l'Agència Europea del Medi Ambient. És llicenciat en matemàtica pura, econòmica i estadística per la Queen's University de Belfast. Va treballar durant bastant de temps al govern britànic en programes i estudis de producció industrial i de tendències en diversos àmbits i des del 1991 ha focalitzat especialment la seva activitat en qüestions de tendències relacionades amb el medi ambient i amb les estructures socials. Ell va ser autor o director del primer informe que es va fer a Gran Bretanya sobre medi ambient i desenvolupament sostenible. I avui el tenim aquí perquè ens parli d'aquestes megatendències. Primer ell farà una exposició d'aproximadament mitja hora, dialogarem una miqueta i després vostès tindran l'oportunitat de preguntar-li. Jock, moltes gràcies per estar aquí entre nosaltres. Podeu començar.
Good evening, thank you very much. So much technology. It's a real privilege to be here. My apologies for speaking in English. My Catalan and Spanish is not up to much. I would like to give a presentation here with keeping two thoughts in our minds. The first one is that in discussing a thing called global megatrends and the idea of trying to look at the future, to bear in mind that we may be asking ourselves more questions than giving answers. And that may be useful for the debate afterwards because I think I have some answers to give, but it would be really interesting to see what answers we could come at together. The second aspect is that when we did global megatrends for the first time in 2010, the response of the policy community in Europe was to say, so what? And the idea that megatrends, which are about 7.5, perhaps 10 billion people at the end of this century, when you've got 450 million people in Europe, this idea of scale sometimes can be difficult for people to comprehend. But I would like you to think about something, and it is that we've looked at global megatrends for the European Union, particularly with an environmental focus, which I'll describe. But it'd be really interesting to think about what global megatrends mean for a region, a country like Spain, a region like Catalonia, and a city like Barcelona, because they are not inconsequential to your setting. And that could be an interesting aspect to maybe consider after the presentation. I assume if I press this button, then my slides will come up. Yep. So I work in the European Environment Agency, and I think it's just worth spending 2 minutes on telling you what it is. It's based in Copenhagen in Denmark. I'm Irish from Belfast, but I've been living in Denmark for 15 years, and I've got 2 children who are not Irish, they're Danish. In Denmark, you teach your children to be Danish from a very early age. They'll never be Irish. We're established under a European regulation, which means that we do have a legal basis. And we're what's called an independent information provider. And the independence point is important because we do work at this interface between science and policy, and it's important to be seen to have legitimacy and credibility in your outputs. We have a very strong network that we liaise with. It's 39 countries, the 28 of the European Union, the 5 countries either around the European Union or inside it, Switzerland. And then the 6 cooperating countries are in the Balkans, the West Balkans. So we have this broad network. We're about 200 people and about 40 million euros budget a year. In our regulation, we're asked every 5 years to produce what's called a State of the Environment and Outlook report for Europe. And I've been either the editor or the author of that report for 10 years now. So I did 2005, 2010, and we're just about to publish 2015 on the 4th of March. And it'll be called this, and it'll be translated into Spanish, probably by the middle of the year. It takes a long time to translate in the European Union. And what is this, the State of the Environment report? Well, it's really our flagship attempt at trying to understand what's happening in Europe's environment, trying to have some perspective on what that means for how it is we interact as society and economies with the environment, and to have a perspective on the future on that. In doing that all the time, we're trying to relate to policies, what we've agreed as societies to try and do, for example, reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40%, by 30% by 2030. Knowing that we really should be reducing greenhouse gas emissions by up to 95% by 2050. So we're looking at how it is we can observe what we see in terms of future prospects as well. What it leads us to is this kind of suite of products. And in it you have 2 reports. The blue one that you'll see is the overall synthesis, where we try to bring everything together. And the orange, not quite sure what color that is global megatrends. So we will have a report in March on global megatrends. All the other elements are what are called 4-page briefings to try and give to policymakers something very digestible in terms of understanding highly complex information. And what we do is we try to look at the Europe's environment from a global perspective, global megatrends. We try to look at it from the main themes and sectors that influence Europe's environment. We try to look at it from a country perspective, because in countries, it's where the implementation of environmental policy happens and where you see trends in environmental change most apparent, and so on. So it's a big exercise for us. When we do global megatrends, the reasoning is that Europe is increasingly influenced by global developments. And the idea of a megatrend is, first of all, it's big, it's very visible, and it's relevant to the world. But it's also something that doesn't necessarily have to change quickly. It can be a slow changing thing, but it can exert a lot of influence on a lot of things in ways which are not that easy to understand. And it could do that in the context of social, technological, economic, environmental, and political perspectives. We call it the STEEP framework, because when you're doing these types of assessments, you always have to have a framework. So this one is called STEEP: social, technological, economic, environmental, and political. And I'm going to present what are 11 megatrends, which you can see down the side of this slide in more detail in the subsequent slides. But why do we look at global megatrends, and why are they relevant for Europe? Well, there's 2 dimensions I'm showing here. There's many others that we could discuss, but perhaps in an unprecedented way, Europe is bound to the rest of the world through a whole range of systems that determine many things that we don't directly influence because of their global nature. And they do actually result in a 2-way flow of many things: ideas, financial resources, materials, in ways which are really complex and interesting. So trying to understand these and what they mean for us in terms of our well-being, and benefits for our well-being, but also costs for our well-being, because pollution is one of the megatrends that we're looking at, and that's a cost to us. The fact that we are impacted, one of the megatrends describes it, the burden of disease, the global burden of disease, which is a World Health Organization metric for looking at the overall impact on us of a range of factors. 25% of that comes from the environment, mainly through air pollution. It's interesting, the dynamic. But then if we come to think about within Europe, what does it mean? Then it comes to this discussion about, well, when we look into the future, when you look at the last 20 years, it's almost unprecedented in the changes that we've observed, the cycle of globalization. When we're looking forward, we're observing that there could be a similar type of effect. It could be greater, it could be less, we don't know. But the idea is to look and to try and be better prepared for what it is that may be coming at us. Because these things are big in scale, they're potentially high in their impacts, and they're potentially multi-layered in their effects on us as people. So we have these socio-economic, technological, environmental and political changes. And what I'm going to show in the next slides is for each of those 11 megatrends, what it is we observe as kind of key findings. So the first megatrend is the issue of population growth. But it's not just about growth, it's about the divergence and how demography is changing across the world. So what we see is a growing population worldwide, but it's mainly in Africa and Asia. And it is going at a slower rate as we grow more prosperous across the world. We have an aging issue, which is very, very important for Europe, because we will not have an increasing population in absolute terms, but we will have an aging population within that number. And that has implications for us, because as an aging population with a reduced workforce, we're likely to see increased migration coming into Europe. We're likely to see that coming from countries which may have growing populations, and therefore people will want to move to have economic and social opportunities elsewhere in the world. Now, we know today that migration is a big debate in Europe, and when you look at these trends, it could become an even bigger debate. And just one of the main findings is this 43% growth of the global population by 2050 compared with 2010. These are big numbers. Now, what does it mean for the environment? Well, we do know that there's a relationship between population growth and environmental impacts. And therefore, it's likely with this growth in population that we will have even more pressure on use of natural resources. And for Europe, that should tell us that we should really think hard about how efficient we are in using resources and how technologically innovative we are in finding substitutes for resources. It can be through nanotechnologies, it can be through various means. So the environmental implications here are around the issue of resource efficiency and resource substitution. The second megatrend is about living in an urban world, where we see that the big number is that 67% of the world's population are expected to be living in cities by 2050. We know that if you develop compact cities, then you end up in your most sustainable kind of urbanization. But in Europe, we've seen over the last 20 years an increasing sprawl in urban areas. The idea of suburban areas, peri-urban areas. It's not a compact approach that we've had in Europe for the last 20 years. We see some nice examples in the rest of the world of compact approaches in places like China and Japan. And so the idea of compact cities will become something rather interesting for the coming decades. But if you look around the world at the major capital cities, then most of them are located on the coast for very good reasons, because they've been developed in line with trade and economic developments of the last 200 years. If climate change, as we expect it to happen, is going to result in sea level rises, how are we going to adapt these cities? Are we going to build big walls? Are we going to move? If you move from Barcelona down the coast, you're not exactly able to move into places that are resilient for development, because they have been already degraded to some extent with the tourism development of the last 20, 30, 40 years. So the choices that we make here are rather profound. But when we do make the choices, we should be thinking about urban design in a very different way than we thought about it for the last century. This trend is about health, and it refers back to what I was saying about the global burden of disease. 25% coming from environmental causes. But this issue of non-communicable diseases overtaking communicable diseases, if I can put it in other words, lifestyle diseases overtaking infectious diseases. Lifestyle being cardiovascular, cancer, diabetes, obesity, as against infectious diseases, viruses, cholera, and those things you get injections for when you go abroad. Can't remember all of them. The idea of this trend, though, changing and how it is we deal with it, because it has substantial implications for our health systems, as we already know, and is likely to increase in the coming decades. Now, the environmental aspects of that they're complex, because in the WHO number, about 25% of the global burden of disease coming from air pollution. We know there are very direct diseases to do with asthma and lung functions generally and other sorts of things. But there's also the indirect, the extent to which pollution from the air and other sources may be contributing to cancers and other types of lifestyle diseases that we see. The use of chemicals in products. And how we don't know, we actually don't know the relationship between the chemicals, the products, their use, and their impacts on our health. But there is evidence in certain science areas sending early warnings and suggesting that we should use the precautionary principle much more in terms of deciding on which chemicals and which products we want to bring into the market. And the precautionary principle is an environmental principle in the European Union Treaty, and it's often misinterpreted as being a principle that stops us doing something. And it's actually not the case. It's a principle which tries to balance between the opportunities of doing something and the risks of doing something, and to say that as societies we should have a better understanding of the balance in terms of the decisions that we take. And if I just give you a very quick example of why the precautionary principle can be very useful, we have published 2 reports in the agency on what's called late lessons from early warnings. And the early warnings come from science, and the late lessons come from our understanding that society often is impacted through deaths and economic losses by innovations of a more, primarily a chemical type, many decades down the line now. And what you find is that the early warnings are often ignored. The private companies that make the products sell them and they make profits, but the costs of the health impacts that result some way down the line fall to the public purse. And therefore, if you wanted to apply the precautionary principle, you would think that it's not about hindering innovation. In fact, it's the opposite. It's about trying to get people to think about what kind of innovation we want. But if we have an innovation, a nanotechnology, which is out there to help us improve how it is we use energy and light bulbs, then you could say that a very small percentage of that company's revenues is put into a bond in anticipation that 40 years down the line there could be impacts from that. If there are impacts from it, then there's a balance in proportion between the costs that fall to the public sector and the costs that fall to the company that created the innovation. If there are no impacts, the company can have its money back. And because it's a bond, they'll have interest on it, and therefore there's no losses. And if the company disappears, then it becomes a social good. The money becomes a social good. Now, these things are not so easy to kind of grasp, because we're not used to this kind of this way of thinking. But it's not impossible to think that we could balance the public-private interests through instruments of this type. Which brings me to the technological change. When we look at global megatrends and technology, we look at what we call the NBIC cluster, and that is nanotechnologies, biotechnologies, information and communication technologies. And these are interesting for the environment area because, for example, if you take information and communication technologies, the energy use in those 2 areas is huge, and the trend in the last 10 years is off the page. if you look at a company like Google and the centers it builds to be able to manage all of the information that is gathering through the algorithms that they've developed in their search engine, then you'll see an example of where this relationship between information technologies and energy is very apparent. And of course, energy is the key source of climate change and climate change impacts. The idea here, though, again, is to say that there are opportunities, nanotechnologies. I have an investment in a company in the London stock market which makes light bulbs from nanomaterials that replace light bulbs that include heavy metals like cadmium, because we banned cadmium under environmental policies, and this comes along with a safer alternative. That company is it's really small. You would call it a niche, but it could become a predominant player in the next 5 years. And the idea is there that you're creating through environmental regulation by banning something which is clearly harmful to us. The idea that people go and look for innovative substitutes, in this case using nanomaterials, and they can start to create new economic models and employment and trade opportunities with it. But when we're looking at technologies, we have to realize that opportunities and risks, as I was describing before, need to be balanced. And so the precautionary principle, as one of the environment principles of the treaty, becomes important here. But the use of foresight and this idea that trying to look forward and balance the fact that we don't know what's going to happen, but at least we should be discussing what may happen and to weigh up how it is we see the opportunities and risks coming from the different scenarios and make decisions on that basis, rather than thinking, as we seem to be today, the prevailing thinking of getting out of the current crisis is to return to what caused the crisis. The idea of we can return to consumption of resources in the way that we were doing up to 2008. It's not sustainable. The next global megatrends are things that you may be more familiar with, in the sense of the idea of growth and economic growth. The predictions from the OECD and others is that there will be a 300% increase in economic growth as measured by GDP by 2050. We know the relationship between growth and resource use is quite clear, the correlation. So the implications for natural resources and environmental impacts are quite clear from that. What would be interesting, though, is to think a little bit about how do we want to measure a good economy? And GDP has been there for 60 years. We invented it, we implemented it in 1953 as a basis for understanding how to pay back to America the debt of the Marshall Plan. That was the reasoning that brought it to a kind of to a system as it is. It's developed way beyond that, but it's not a system for, I think, measuring what it is we want to understand to be an economic performance of the type that marries together economic growth objectives with environmental objectives, with social objectives. GDP was never designed for that, but we haven't managed to find an alternative in the 60 years. Despite the fact that the people who wrote the system for GDP said that this does not include enough about social aspects, it does not include environmental externalities, so somebody should do some work on it. And 60 years later, we're still doing it. From a unipolar to a multipolar world, it's very interesting, because you could imagine how quickly the economic balance is shifting between the European Union and the rest of the world. The unipolar here is referring to mainly America, but you could actually talk about the US-EU relationship in the second half of the 20th century. But this figure showing that the OECD countries, of which the EU is a major part, alongside America, Canada, Australia and others, you see this sharp fall in the contribution to GDP, global GDP, from 77% to 42% by 2050. And then the intensified competition for resources. When I saw this figure, I kind of went, wow, a 10-fold increase in the use of resources in a century. It's kind of like, it's pretty incredible to think about. And the idea of it doubling between 2010 and 2030 doesn't sound as it doesn't sound as impressive, but actually when you're at the level that we're at, a doubling by 2030 is rather scary. Yeah? But when it comes to the environment discussion, then two things are in play. One is that if we're looking for solutions through renewable energy technologies and other technologies to some of our problems, then the rare metals that are often the current basis for doing that are not located in Europe. They're located in other parts of the world, and often in other parts of the world that are not so easy to influence when it comes to getting access to those resources. And this chart, which doesn't, I guess, look very clear from here, is showing that the red is China when you look at the lines. But there's one that's not on that, which is lithium, which we want for electric cars and for other for a lot of our technologies in terms of having more sustainable batteries, and that's in Bolivia for large part. So Europe then has to think, how are we going to adapt? How are we going to find substitutes for this? How are we going to, and we have to do it through innovation. We have to invest in innovation, and we do it through the research program of the European Union. We do it through research programs in countries, but we don't necessarily do it through the financial market in the same way that we should be doing it. We have venture capital, which is looking at how to support innovations, but largely the financial markets are made up of fossil mineral-based companies, or car manufacturers, information technology, energy-hungry information technology companies, banks, and pension funds. And it's rather interesting if we think, looking at a subsequent megatrend on climate change, if we defossilize the world, i.e. we move away from a reliance on fossil fuels and move to renewable energy technologies, where does the financial system go in terms of where it makes its investments? And the opportunity today is to actually decide today that we want to invest much more proportionally in innovations which are going to deal with this type of megatrend. The current evidence is we're not doing it. And I think partly it's because we're still looking for a return to pre-crisis trends. The next three trends are environmental, and we're an environment agency, and so these ones are much more directly relevant to what is we're talking about here. And I just want to bring out 2 points here. One is the issue of meat consumption, and the idea that we use 5 times more land, but also it's 7 times more CO2 per kilogram of meat compared with per kilogram of vegetable cereal. And then the issue of bioenergy. I mean, it's probably one of the most regrettable decisions that's been made in the last 10, 15 years to look for 10% of transport fuel coming from bioenergy sources. Because it's created market distortions and investments that have been really misallocated, I should say. And if we look at go back to the population trends, the urbanization trends, and the issue of food and how it is we're going to produce food in the next decades, I think one issue that has to be rather clear is that there shouldn't be any bioenergy coming from food. Here we see something that I think you'll be quite aware of with respect to the climate change, and this graph just tries to show, by having in 2013 much more dark red and purple than in 2001, that the science of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is telling us that the situation is accelerating for us. There's still many uncertainties in the science, but there is an increasing understanding that these systems of production and consumption that we have cannot be sustained beyond the next 20, 30 years. Otherwise, we're going to be in some difficulties. And we're seeing difficulties, but they're not they're manageable difficulties at the minute. If you talk about flooding and talk about drought episodes, but they could become systemic, really, in their character, and unmanageable in their character sooner than we may think. Again, we don't know, but again, it's a matter of looking and asking questions and trying to find different answers than business as usual. This one is just looking at environmental pollution from the perspective of the air, the wastewater, and the movement of pollution in terms of air between continents. And just to say that what we do in Europe influences the rest of the world, and what the rest of the world does can influence what's happening in Europe, and in this case, particularly to our health. The megatrend shown here about nitrogen demand is really about agriculture and the drive for food and how to feed the increasing population. Now, we're not lacking nitrogen, but it does have quite a lot of pollution impacts that are not very desirable. We are lacking phosphorus, and it is one of the main components of fertilizer used in intensive crop production. So there are some resource constraints here as well to be thought about. And again, it comes to the idea of innovation in terms of how it is we're managing agriculture. But the issue of food waste, if we understand the trends, then in Europe we're wasting 35% of our food, which is something that we can do a lot about. The last trend is one of my favorites, because I think that coming to the question of global megatrends for Europe, global megatrends for Catalonia, global megatrends for Barcelona, I think when we look at the last 20 years and the things that have happened, and in our estimation and many others' estimation, the unprecedented nature of them, and the fact that there are so many of them, and they're interlinked and interconnected in ways which we don't understand. The World Economic Forum produces a report every year called Global Risks, and it talks about how governments are just so unable to manage, to deal with it. And our democratic system is based on 200 years of a certain way of doing things. This trend shows how we've tried to develop international agreements, and perhaps the heyday of international global agreements is the 1990s. The 2000s is not so bad, but it's clearly falling away, and we know from the politics of the last 10 years that global agreements have become much more complicated than they were previously. And so when you look across all of these megatrends and the complex nature of them, then one automatic response may be we should have more global agreements, and we should have at least more global cooperation on how to deal with the trends that we're observing. And the answer is that we're not, that it's falling away. But perhaps governments are not the answer, which brings me to the Catalonia Barcelona point, because if you wanted to have a discussion in Europe about global megatrends, it's almost impossible, because we have 23 languages, 450 million people trying to have a discussion using all of these wonderful communication tools we have now. It's not that easy to do. But if you come to a city like Barcelona, with all of its richness of democratic heritage, with all of its kind of wonderfulness, but the fact that it's on the sea and that it may be impacted by climate change and all these other things, it'd be a great conversation to have around these global megatrends with people using internet tools and other mechanisms. You have a history, I think. I don't know what your present is like. I've read quite a bit of history of this of Spain and this region. But the idea of trying to have conversations, which means that when we come to governance of these complex problems, we're not looking for governments only for the solution. We're looking to ourselves, and we're looking to the idea that we need to have conversations amongst ourselves to be able to work through the complexities, recognizing that we don't have the answers. But at least if we have the conversation together, we may arrive at common approaches to problems that we don't fully understand, solutions that we don't fully have at our grasp, in a much more effective way than leaving it to either governments, which is the prevailing democratic model, or business, which is a growing influence, particularly in the latest globalization cycle. It all comes back to climate change, really, because it's probably the number one issue confronting the world, and it's not necessarily reflected in how it is we govern the world. I would like to finish by talking about how it is one then tries to take 11 global megatrends and understand what they mean together and what they may mean for Europe and Europe's environment. And this one, I don't have an answer because we're trying to write the analysis as I stand here. So we have to finish it by the middle of January to be available for publication on the 4th of March. But the model that we use in this case is this one to show that actually we need to consider the relationship between food, water, housing, and energy and transport. They're very strongly interlinked, and how they contribute to our well-being, but how they also are managed with respect to the ecosystems, the natural environment in Europe, but the natural environment globally, because our food is largely imported. We import more food than we domestically eat Europe-wide. I think in Spain, I would imagine that you eat much more domestically produced food than imported food. But where I come from, in Denmark, they have 26 million pigs, and I think 20 million of them may go to Japan. So we have a varied picture around Europe, but generally we have a big import reliance on our food, which means that we are relying on ecosystems in the rest of the world to support something very fundamental to our daily lives. So we have this model, and we're trying to assess between these different dimensions of resources, the 4 resources, the ecosystems of a European and global type, and how it impacts on our health and well-being, to try and understand how these megatrends together can be understood. But the answer is that I think we have 20 people working in the area of integrated assessments, and we have 2 people working on global megatrends. And I think I could put those 2 people on global megatrends for the next 5 years, and they would still only arrive at some 10% of the potential to be able to explore this area, because it's so rich and so vast and so complex. But we will come with something, and the idea is to look at it with respect to direct impacts, to try and say to policymakers, there are things that are going to happen in Europe, may happen in Europe, but there are also things that are happening outside of Europe that we should be paying more attention to. And the interesting thing about environmental policy is that it's been probably one of the main successes of the European Union in the last 40 years. And we're now at a halfway point between that successful 40 years and the idea that we may not have a habitable planet in the next 40 years. Europe has been very good at environmental policy because Europe has been able to control environmental policy. If you look at the trends that we're observing, many of them are outside of our influence. Many of them are outside of our knowledge. And that makes it for a very different dynamic for Europe in the coming 40 years, because we don't control, we don't influence, and we don't understand or have the knowledge necessary to manage things for the next 40 years in the way that we've been very successfully able to manage things in the past 40 years. My wish is that we could have many more discussions on this, and I'm looking forward now maybe to having a discussion here. But I would encourage this idea that maybe as a region and a city you might want to think that looking at these trends would be as relevant to your own situation as we have tried to do it for the European Union situation. And with that, I will stop. Thank you.
Exposició, estic segura que tots coincidiran amb mi de que cada una dels punts d'aquestes megatendències necessitarien un desenvolupament d'una xerrada més, cada una d'elles. Crec que també és comú la impressió general, i jo l'he tingut també aquesta nit, de que quan les posem totes juntes donen la idea de que és tan gros cada una d'elles, i totes elles relacionades molt més, que sembla que tinguéssim poquíssimes possibilitats d'incidir sobre tot això. Què podem fer cada un de nosaltres sobre cada una d'aquestes immenses coses? Sí, estem dient que Europa que fins ara és el nostre univers i aquest europacentrisme que hem tingut fins ara s'està esvaint, doncs d'aquí a 50 anys serà una part petitíssima del món en quant a població, en quant a territori, etc. Però bé, precisament perquè el món és complex, se fan aquests cicles per intentar comprendre'ls. I jo volia aprofundir en alguns dels aspectes que el Jock ha tractat en aquesta conferència. Jock, fa una setmana tenia l'oportunitat de parlar amb un pedagog brasiler que es diu Pablo Gentile, que ell ha analitzat els processos d'exclusió social i com l'educació influeix en el món de les grans ciutats. I ell parlava que a Latinoamèrica, però també a Àfrica i també a altres països, com vostè ha dit en la seva conferència, s'està produint una gran concentració de la població a les ciutats. Cada persona que se'n va del camp és un productor d'aliments que sosté la seva família, menys, i un treballador en busca de feina que necessita aliments, que algú li proporcioni els aliments, en la ciutat. El resultat és que s'estan creant megaciutats que cada vegada costa més governar-les. Només hem de pensar que a la Xina cada any 34 milions de persones van del camp a la ciutat. I per tant el model de ciutat passarà a ser molt important. Si en aquests moments a ciutats com São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Nairobi i les ciutats més grans de l'Índia, per exemple, resulta molt difícil governar no només la pau social, sinó simplement les necessitats bàsiques. Com fem per arbitrar, com fem per entomar tota aquesta població que estarà en aquestes megaciutats? Pablo Gentili parlava de que en els últims anys s'està observant que el procés de guetització que portava a la gent pobra a concentrar-se en faveles s'està completant ara amb un procés de guetització de la gent rica que es tanca en barris hermèticament protegits per muralles tecnològiques que fa que no s'ajuntin amb els altres. Com ho veu? Com creu que aquest escenari de grans ciutats, com podem fer-les governables?
If I say I don't know, can we move on to the next question? I think that, the idea of how we meet our basic needs and how we can transform from how we do it currently to something very different is very much within our grasp. I mean, the food area is very interesting because, as I mentioned in my presentation, if we are, through the estimates that we see, wasting a third of our food, then that's a lot of improvement we can make. But we're not going to make it as consumers, and this is something that I find a very interesting trend of the last 10 years. There seems to be a lot of discussion about consumption and how it is we consume that. As if to say, and I've heard large businesses say this, I'm very pro-business, by the way, but sometimes there needs to be a conversation. I've heard large businesses say in a recent conference that it's for the consumer to sort it out. And for us, it's really about the provisioning systems. You really have to get at where things are coming from, and then we can start to see how things may change further along the line now. So if you take food, the fact that we are packaging food in the way that we're doing it, the fact that we may be exporting as much beef from the European Union to Argentina as Argentina is exporting back to the European Union. Now, it may be different beef, and it may be that Argentinian beef is better than European Union beef, but I wouldn't imagine if we have this trade thing going on. But it doesn't seem sensible. The idea of how it is we take agriculture to the market, I don't know what happens in Spain. I think you have a much more sustainable way of doing things. But I know in the country that I was born in, we actually decide that we do not give people either potatoes, which is a very staple diet of Ireland, that are the wrong shape. The idea that we actually take them out and we don't put them into the market because they're not a desirable shape for the consumer. Who decided that? I didn't decide it. I'm quite happy to eat a potato as long as it tastes of a potato, regardless of the shape. So we're deciding in the production processes to do lots of things which are not necessarily necessary. They're not needed, and they're not desirable either for us as citizens. So in the food area, we can do a lot around enhanced efficiency of the whole system. We can also look at the idea of urban agriculture. I like this idea. In Copenhagen, you can buy honey and beer made with honey and various things made with honey coming from bees that are in the city. Now people talk about the pollution impacts and how it is you may be eating honey which is detrimental to your health, but the research says it's very, very minimal. The idea of though urban agriculture and being able to look at cities as a place where we make food as well as live is something that a research in the UK said that there were probably 100 harvests left in the UK soil. But if you go to urban areas, there's many centuries of harvest left because we haven't touched those soils. So we could decide to adapt how it is we want agriculture to be done from a prevailing rural activity for urban people to something somewhat different. You mentioned Sao Paulo. It's interesting on mobility. The mayor of Sao Paulo, who was elected in June of 2013, so 18 months ago, one of the biggest, sprawliest cities in the world, has built 170 kilometers of cycle paths in 18 months. And to do that, he's had to build them over large roads that have been part of the sprawl. But the idea of deciding to do something and being courageous and saying that sometimes you just have to do something because it's for the greater good. And 170 kilometers of cycle paths in 18 months is rather impressive. It's a rather impressive statistic. It's resulted in, I think, 10% of people getting on bicycles, which in Copenhagen I think is 45% in the commuting on a daily basis. So you can see where the potential is to go forward. Similarly with housing, the idea of technologies that can help us manage our energy and water and other types of natural resource use. They have a lot of potential here, but we don't have necessarily the mechanisms through government to encourage financial markets to make those things happen. We tend to put subsidies forward, and the subsidies tend to be rather small in size, and they tend to be rather half-hearted in their distribution. But we don't need subsidies. If we can create the market conditions within which people can recognize that this is a useful thing to have because resource prices are going up and it's good to have efficiency in how it is you're living in your day-to-day home. So there's many opportunities. So I have a rather, the environment is regarded as a rather pessimistic area because we regulate, we tell people not to do things. And so people tend to go like, oh God, don't really like those environmental people. But I think we have, with this future and this resource situation, a very optimistic and engaging and positive agenda to put forward. But it's not our agenda. It's a society agenda because it requires many different things to happen. And we need to have the conversation about how we want the financial markets to operate, and we can adapt those through government policy. How we want the fiscal system to operate. So our fiscal system is there to tax income. If Europe is going to have many more people not working than working in the coming 40 years, it's not a sustainable fiscal system. So we need to shift over to resources, taxing resources and pollution, bad things, and overuse of resources and pollution, which are bad things, away from good things. But if we do decide to then become a defossilized Europe, we'll have lost the tax revenues. So how are we going to make the tax system work in that case? And the answer is we don't know, but we should be thinking about it rather than assuming it's business as usual for the next 40 years. So there's many systems that are worth looking at.
El problema és que és veritat que es poden fer coses, fins i tot a nivell individual, es pot tenir un consum responsable, es pot incentivar l'agricultura de proximitat comprant productes de proximitat i d'estació, estacionals, etc. I tot això té un impacte, segur, el veiem. Per exemple, ha fet més pel benestar animal el que molts joves es fessin vegetarians, això és el que ha fet moure la indústria càrnica a canviar els processos de tractament dels animals, quan han vist que hi havia una reacció del consumidor. El problema és que els temps dels hàbits que poden implicar canvis i els temps dels mercats són molt desproporcionadament diferents. Vostè ha mencionat en la seva conferència com fer convergir interessos privats de les empreses, dels productors a curt termini, amb interessos públics generals, que són sempre a més gran termini. Per exemple, sobre l'alimentació, mentre estem fent aquests moviments a Europa a favor d'aquest comerç de proximitat, a l'Àfrica molts autors estan parlant de que s'està vivint una segona colonització, perquè en aquests moments grans companyies de capital americà, xinès i europeu estan comprant terrenys en una proporció mai vista fins ara. És a dir, estan comprant els països sencers per la via de comprar els camps de producció. I ho volen per fer productes per l'energia. És a dir, fins ara moltes vegades era per alimentar les persones del món ric, però ara ja és per alimentar els cotxes de les persones del món ric. Com fem perquè se ralentitza una miqueta aquestes tendències? Hem de posar alguna... Hi ha possibilitats de posar algun límit a les tendències tan accelerades del mercat?
The first part of your question was about the consumer and how we could change, and I do think that we need to change the narrative away from the consumer to the producer. We need to think that we have these complex systems of provisioning, which we then use in whatever ways we want to use them. But the dialogue and the narrative in the last 10 years has moved to the consumer, and we need to move it back to the producer. But if you look at agriculture, it's a very interesting area. When we look at environmental regulations, we've tended to focus environmental regulations on the primary producer. And the primary producer is farmers. There's some very rich farmers in the world, and there's a lot of farmers who are not rich and have declining incomes if you look at the statistics of the last 20 years. So is that where we want to put the burden of regulation? Because regulation costs money, against the fact that further along the chain that we have food processors and retailers and others who are using food primary production for products and other things, and that's where the money is. So maybe we should be thinking about our regulatory framework in a different way. But I would like us to change this narrative, which seems to have shifted towards we are responsible. Of course, we have a responsibility, but it's a shared responsibility in a more system understanding. The dimension of land grabs, which is how I've interpreted your point about countries moving into Africa and elsewhere to take up land. I think this is where we're suffering from the fall away in international agreements, and the idea of just international cooperation on issues like this. I'm not saying that an international cooperation would solve this issue, but we do. I think there's an increasing recognition that we want a different market. We want a different set of market rules. We want a market because the market has been very effective. It has externalities to the environment. It has externalities to us in terms of impacts on our health. But it's been a very, very effective model. And I don't think anybody's questioning the value of the market in terms of the overall model. But the way the model works currently is not sustainable. Having new rules which are respecting the externalities to the environment, respecting the externalities to our health in terms of impacts from pollution, would go some way to starting to create a different type of global dialogue. If you go to the World Economic Forum and you look at their global risks report, it's very interesting to read from the perspective of that organization. It produces it in the middle of January every year. And a week later, all of these famous people meet in Davos in Switzerland. You've probably heard of the group of people, mostly famous, some not so famous. But they have this dialogue about the future of the economy, the world, and so on. And this global risk report is timed just to coincide with that discussion every year. And it's a very effective and interesting way of putting knowledge on the table at the right time.
Vostè sap que en aquests moments estan reunits a Lima representants de 195 països que intenten arribar a un acord perquè tingui èxit la conferència de París que s'ha de celebrar l'any vinent, en la qual s'ha de trobar un nou protocol de Kyoto que ha de substituir el protocol de Kyoto. En les últimes setmanes hem tingut notícies molt positives. Per primera vegada Xina i Estats Units han acceptat posar sobre paper un compromís de reducció de les emissions, que fins ara no s'havia aconseguit. Recordem que entre els dos representen gairebé la meitat dels gasos d'efecte hivernacle que es produeixen en aquest moment i que contribueixen al canvi climàtic. Però no està resultant fàcil. A Lima hi ha ara mateix una discussió que és que perquè la resta de països es puguin sumar-se a un acord ha d'haver-hi unes compensacions pels països pobres que també reclamen el seu dret a desenvolupar-se. De fet, nosaltres, el nostre desenvolupament ha sigut fins ara el responsable que hagin arribat a la situació en què estem ara. Llavors, vostè creu que arribarem a un acord per d'aquí a París? Tindrem un nou protocol de Kyoto?
My answer to this one is I don't know.
Què creu?
I mean, the European Environment Agency is an information provider. We're a knowledge kind of institution. If I was looking at it from a knowledge perspective, then we do have evidence from looking at environmental policy over the last 20 years that when you create the kind of targets for reductions of the type we're talking about here, then it does create bottlenecks in the economic system, which does lead to innovations, which does result in technologies, but not only technologies, also knowledge about how to manage things in different ways. And therefore, coming at it from a knowledge institution perspective, there is kind of, I think, some value in considering the idea that technology transfer still has some merit alongside or instead of compensation. I mean, we have compensation from the COP15 in Copenhagen. I think it was something like 100 billion euros or $100 billion over 10 years. But I don't think much has materialized in the 5 years since. But the idea of technology transfer could be an option. Another idea could be global common approaches to research into solving problems. The idea that maybe we set aside the national interest, the regional interest, and we try to think that we have science and knowledge and abilities across the world which are rather huge in their character and diversity, and to try and find ways of bringing people together. I'm reminded as a statistician who used to produce GDP in the UK that when they wanted to make the system of national accounts, which is used to calculate GDP, and they did it 60 years ago, they invited people from 25 countries to Cambridge University in England and said, can you in 6 weeks produce the framework? And the answer was yes. They did it. And that became a framework of, I think it was 42 pages of whatever it was. Today it's 1,500 pages. So the idea of just doing something to try and change things through a collaborative approach has merit. And science has a lot to offer, and scientists are very adept at working together across borders. They have their other characteristics which we won't go into, but the idea of trying to go at this from a knowledge perspective could be interesting. Technology transfer, knowledge transfer, and the idea of trying to collaborate on research in a kind of global setting.
Si la política treballés tan cooperativament com treballa la ciència, ja tindria una meitat dels problemes resolts, ben segur, però no és així. La qual cosa planteja l'última qüestió que li volia abans de donar pas a l'audiència, això planteja un problema de governança. Vostè ha dit, quan els Estats Units va voler crear un sistema de comptabilitat nacional que fos homologable, transferible i que tots ens hi poguessin entendre en aquest sistema, en 6 setmanes van crear el sistema. El problema és que en aquell moment hi havia una potència que tenia la capacitat de convocar i tenia la capacitat de forçar una resposta. En aquests moments no es vislumbra que hi hagi aquesta potència, una sola potència. Més aviat estem en la transició d'un món que era bipolar, després unipolar, i ara finalment no se sap, perquè més aviat sembla que sigui multipolar, però no se sap quins seran els amos de cada un d'aquests eixos polars. Clar, com aconseguim això? És a dir, el tema de la governança global no exigiria una... El problema és que tothom sap que s'ha de fer un nou sistema de governança, però no hi ha ningú que tingui la força de dir en 6 mesos. No? Com ho veu?
You ask very difficult questions for a knowledge, for a person working in a knowledge institution of the type I work in. We do look at the governance issue, and we look at it from the perspective of, as I mentioned in my presentation, these megatrends, when understood together, to the extent that we can understand them, they are huge. And it's enough to tell us that we need to have something different. But if we're going to have something different, then recognize that with the hugeness comes complexity. With the complexity comes uncertainty. With the uncertainty comes risks. With the risk, you can also have opportunities. So we need to be able to somehow create a narrative within which we can understand how to discuss these things. And then you might have an opportunity to discuss it within a government setting. But I think, and we discussed this in the global megatrends, but also in the late lessons from early warnings reports I was mentioning, the value of trying to engage people, society in these discussions is huge, and our ability to do it is almost zero. But the opportunity that's being offered, and of course it's happening in informal ways. People are having debates, people are taking actions via being able to understand things very quickly and in big numbers of people through the internet. But it's happening in an informal setting. If we could build on those successes of informal kind of working together on solving problems and bring them to these bigger problems, there's an opportunity to do it. It's not easy, but the opportunity is there, and it's a matter of trying to marry together that, as the World Economic Forum says, governments are behind the curve when it comes to being able to address these issues. So now we need to look at how it is we can do it in some combination. And the combination has to be something like government with business, with civil society organizations, but with us ourselves. And the us ourselves, for me, could be the interesting bit. Not easy to do, but worth an investment. And lots of innovation will result. Lots of innovation.
Moltes gràcies, Jock, per haver contestat tan pacientment a preguntes que eren realment complexes perquè volien abarcar massa, potser.